every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. A river doesn't hold memories. It holds water, silt, and secrets. In the Pacific Northwest, the Green River is a thread of life, carving its way through a landscape of profound and brooding beauty. It slides through forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock. Its waters cold and swift, an eternal, indifferent current. It is a place where the noise of civilization fades, replaced by the rush of water over stone and the whisper of wind through the trees. In the early 1980s, this region was a land of contrasts, of burgeoning tech cities like Seattle pushing against vast untamed wilderness. It was a place of opportunity and a place to get lost. But in the summer of 1982, the river's primeval silence was broken. It began to give up its secrets, and they were secrets of the most terrible and incomprehensible kind. It began on July 15th, with a frantic discovery. Two young boys floating on inner tubes down a lazy stretch of the river near Kent saw something pale and unnatural snagged on a logjam beneath a bridge. It was the body of a young woman. Her name was Wendy Lee Caulfield. She was 16 years old, a runaway who had been pulled into the dangerous orbit of the SeaTac Strip, a notorious corridor of cheap motels and all-night businesses along Pacific Highway South. She had been strangled. Her discovery was a tragedy, but in a county with a growing population and its share of urban decay, it was not yet an alarm bell. The alarm began to ring less than a month later. On August 12th, a man collecting scrap metal beneath the Interstate 5 bridge over the Green River found the remains of another woman, 23-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner. Then, just 3 days later, on August 15th, the river offered up two more of its dead in a single, horrifying event. A man fishing from an inflatable raft spotted the body of Marcia Chapman, 31, weighed down by rocks in shallow water. As police secured the scene, they found the remains of another victim just yards away. Cynthia Hines, 17. 2 days, 3 bodies, all from the same small stretch of river. The random tragedies were now a terrifying, undeniable pattern. This wasn't happenstance. This was a hunting ground. The dawning horror in King County was palpable. A predator of unprecedented scale was at work, moving silently through the margins of their society. The media, recognizing the terror of a killer who used the landscape itself as a weapon, gave him his name, the Green River Killer. Law enforcement didn't know it yet, but they were standing at the edge of a chasm, staring into one of the longest, most monstrous, and most frustrating killing sprees in American history. The man they were hunting was a ghost, a phantom who preyed on the vulnerable and the forgotten, leaving behind a trail of grief that would stretch for 20 agonizing years. He was a man who went to work every day, who had a wife, who attended church, a man who could look you in the eye and give you a friendly nod. He was a ghost hidden in the glaring, ordinary light of the mundane. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a prolific killer. We will examine the case of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Our focus is not just on the horror of his crimes, but on the precise mechanics of his devastating success. How did one man manage to murder so many, for so long, while remaining a whisper in the files of the largest homicide investigation the country had ever seen? We will explore the anatomy of his camouflage, the terrifyingly ordinary life that masked an insatiable monster. We will dissect the anatomy of the investigation, a sprawling 2-decade battle against a shapeless enemy, an effort that pushed forensic science to its limits and forced a legendary detective to consult with the devil himself. And finally, we will analyze the anatomy of a deal, a stunning moral compromise that asked a horrifying question. What is the true price of justice when the truth is buried in dozens of unmarked graves? To understand the killer, you must first understand his victims. They were not just statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and sometimes mothers, each with a story that ended in the cold waters of the Green River or the damp soil of a forgotten wood. Wendy Caulfield, the first to be found, was a child of the system, shuttled between foster homes, a girl whose desire for independence led her to the streets. Deborah Bonner was a young woman trying to find her footing, a life derailed by struggles that made her vulnerable. Marcia Chapman was a mother of two, separated from her children by circumstance, trying to make enough money on the strip to get back on her feet. Cynthia Hines was just 17, a runaway whose life had barely begun. Their stories were different, but they shared a common, fatal thread. They were women whose lives had pushed them to the fringes, into a world where disappearance was a constant risk, and society's safety net was full of holes. The killer had identified this tragic ecosystem with predatory precision. He knew that these were women whose absence might not be noticed for days or weeks, whose cries for help might go unheard. Their vulnerability was his shield. As the body count climbed through the fall of 1982, with the discovery of Opal Mills, 26, and Giselle Livorne, 17, the King County Sheriff's Office was thrown into a state of controlled chaos. The detective assigned to lead the investigation was a young, tenacious man named Dave Reichert. He and his colleagues were immediately overwhelmed. This wasn't a single, isolated homicide. It was a mass murder in slow motion. The killer was operating with a chilling efficiency that suggested practice. An incident room was set up, the walls quickly covered with maps of King County, each new victim marked with a colored pin. The pins began to cluster, forming a terrifying geography of death centered around the Green River, the SeaTac Strip, and the wooded areas near the airport. By 1984, the problem had grown so immense that the Green River Task Force was officially formed. It was an unprecedented multi-agency effort, pulling in detectives from across the state and eventually expertise from the FBI. The task force was deluged with information. Thousands upon thousands of tips poured in. Every strange John, every disgruntled boyfriend, every man who had ever been seen talking to a prostitute on the strip became a potential suspect. In an era before computerized databases, this information was logged on index cards, creating a literal mountain of paperwork. The list of potential suspects ballooned to over 10,000 names. The investigation was a brute force effort, a painstaking process of elimination. Detectives worked 16-hour days, fueled by coffee and a grim sense of duty, chasing down leads that evaporated into dead ends. They were hunting a needle in a haystack the size of a county. The killer's methodology was both simple and maddeningly effective. He was a strangler. Forensic experts know that ligature strangulation is a deeply personal, intimate form of violence. It requires control, physical strength, and a terrifying proximity to the victim. The killer had to look into the eyes of his victims as he took their lives, yet, after this brutal intimacy, his disposal of the bodies was impersonal, almost industrial. He often left them in clusters, creating dump sites. This clustering was a key behavioral signature. To investigators, it suggested a degree of organization, a comfort with the terrain, and a chilling need to keep his victims, in a perverse sense, together. It also served a practical purpose. By dumping multiple bodies in one area, he risked a single major discovery, but he minimized his own travel and exposure over time. He was playing the odds. and for a terrifyingly long time he was winning. As the body count climbed into the double digits through 1983, the pressure on the task force became immense. The public was terrified, the media was relentless, and the killer was accelerating. He was a machine. He picked up women, killed them, and disposed of them with a practiced ease that bespoke years of dark rehearsal. And somewhere in that sea of data, in the stacks of file folders and index cards, his name appeared for the first time. It was just one of thousands, a faint signal in a universe of noise. The name was Gary Leon Ridgway. He was a 34-year-old truck painter at the local Kenworth plant in Renton, a job he'd held for over a decade. He was married, lived in a modest suburban home, and was known to frequent the same areas where the victims were disappearing. His name first entered the files because his truck had been seen in an area where a victim was last known to be alive. Later, a prostitute reported him to the police, claiming he had put her in a chokehold, and that she had barely escaped with her life. He was brought in for questioning in April 1983. He was calm, cooperative, and utterly unremarkable. He denied everything. To the investigators buried in Leeds, he was just one more possibility on a sprawling list. He came onto their radar again more seriously in 1984, this time as a primary suspect. His ex-wife had contacted police, reporting his obsessive and strange sexual habits. Another girlfriend told them he had once tried to strangle her during sex. The pieces were there. He fit the geographical profile. He had a history of violence towards women in his target group. He was, on paper, a very strong suspect, so they brought him in again. And this time, they asked him to take a polygraph test. On May 10, 1984, the wires and sensors of a lie detector were strapped to his arm. He was asked the crucial questions. Did he kill the women found in the Green River? Was he the Green River killer? The needles on the machine barely quivered. The examiner's conclusion was unequivocal. No deception indicated. He passed. The fallibility of the polygraph is now widely understood, especially when dealing with psychopathic personalities who may not exhibit the same physiological stress responses as a neurotypical person. But in 1984, the polygraph was still seen by many in law enforcement as a powerful, almost mystical tool for discerning truth from lies. With that result, Gary Ridgway, the man who was at that very moment in the midst of the most prolific serial murder spree in the nation's history, was effectively dismissed. The task force, trusting the science, moved on. The ghost had been in their grasp, and they had let him go. He walked out of the police station and back into the world, free to continue his work. And for the next 17 years he did. The failure to identify Ridgway in 1984 highlights the profound challenges that faced the task force. They were hunting a new breed of monster with old tools. In the early 1980s, forensic science was in its adolescence. DNA profiling was still a distant dream. The most powerful tool investigators had for understanding the mind of an unknown killer was a new and controversial field, criminal profiling. Desperate for any kind of break, the task force reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico, the legendary Mind Hunters. Men like John Douglas and Robert Keppel, pioneers in the field, were asked to create a psychological portrait of the man they were hunting. Based on the crime scenes, the victimology, the disposal sites, and the method of murder, they constructed a profile. The killer, they theorized, was a white male, likely in his late 20s to mid-30s. He was intelligent, but probably an underachiever, working a blue-collar or semi-skilled job. This job would give him a degree of freedom and a plausible reason to be driving at odd hours. and it likely wouldn't be intellectually demanding. Leaving his mind free to wander and plan, he knew the local geography intimately, the secluded roads, the illegal dump sites, the lovers' lanes. He was not a drifter. He was a local. He would appear disarmingly normal, even friendly or meek. He would be married or have a girlfriend, using the stability of a domestic life as a perfect camouflage. They believed he would be a master of compartmentalization, able to build a firewall in his mind between his horrific secret life and his mundane everyday existence. The profile was eerily, astoundingly accurate. It described Gary Ridgway in almost every conceivable detail. But a profile is not a name. It is a guide, a way to filter the thousands of suspects down to a manager. The problem was, hundreds, if not thousands of men in King County fit that general description. The profile was a ghost story, a detailed description of a phantom they couldn't see. In their quest for insight, the investigators took an unprecedented and deeply unsettling step. They decided to consult an expert, not from law enforcement, but from the darkest corners of the human psyche. They went to speak with a man who understood the mind of a serial killer from the inside, Ted Bundy. In 1984, Bundy was on death row in Florida, his own reign of terror long over. He had followed the Green River case with a detached professional interest. When Dave Reichert and Robert Keppel visited him, Bundy was surprisingly eager to offer his analysis. Sitting across from the men hunting a monster, one of America's most notorious monsters began to dissect a peer. Bundy's insights were chillingly perceptive. He dismissed the idea that the killer was a frenzied, out-of-control madman. "He's not a guy who's going to stand out in a crowd," Bundy told them. He was methodical. He was controlled. Bundy theorized that the killer derived a deep, almost proprietary satisfaction from his crimes. He believed the killer viewed his victims as possessions. This, Bundy explained, was why he was returning to the dump sites. "He'll be back," Bundy warned them. The disposal of the body wasn't the end of the crime. It was an extension of it. The dump site became a sacred personal space. He would return to relive the moment of the murder, to have a continuing perverse relationship with the corpses of his victims. Bundy was describing necrophilia, but also something more, a need for ownership that transcended death. He urged the police to conduct 24-hour surveillance on the dump sites, not just to catch him in the act of disposing of a new victim, but to catch him in the act of remembrance. He also spoke at length about the killer's camouflage. He would be, Bundy insisted, the person you would least suspect, or even the person you might most suspect, but could never prove it. He used himself as the prime example, the handsome, charming law student who hid a bottomless well of depravity. The Green River killer, he said, would be similar, a man whose public persona was so blandly normal that no one would ever look twice. Finally, Bundy offered a warning. He told them the killer was smart enough to know the police were building a profile of him. He might change his methods, alter his dumping patterns, or even go dormant for a while just to throw them off. He was playing a game with them, a long, deadly game of chess. The consultation was both a breakthrough and a source of profound frustration. Bundy had given them a terrifyingly clear window into the killer's mind, but he hadn't given them a name. The task force acted on his advice. They conducted surveillance on the dump sites. They re-examined suspects who fit the unassuming profile. But the killer remained elusive, and just as Bundy predicted, after 1984, the pattern began to change. The discoveries of bodies slowed to a trickle. For a time, it seemed as if the killer might have stopped, or died, or been incarcerated for another crime. The task force, which at its peak had more than 50 full-time investigators, began to shrink due to budget cuts and political pressure. The case grew cold, a vast, unsolved wound on the soul of the region. But Gary Ridgway hadn't stopped. He had simply become more careful, more cunning. He was no longer dumping bodies in clusters along the Green River. He was scattering them, taking them further afield into neighboring counties, burying them in more remote locations where they were less likely to be found. He was adapting, evolving, learning from the massive police presence that was focused on his old hunting grounds. And all the while, he continued to live his life of stunning, deceptive normalcy. He was a fixture at the Kenworth truck plant in Renton. For 32 years, he showed up for his shift painting trucks. He was a reliable, if quiet, employee. Co-workers described him as a bit odd, socially awkward but harmless. He was married for a third time to a woman named Judith. By all outward appearances, they were a normal suburban couple. But behind closed doors, his behavior was deeply strange. Judith would later recount his insatiable and often bizarre sexual demands, his emotional emptiness, and an unnerving habit of creeping around the house at night, startling her in the dark. He would disappear for hours on end, his whereabouts a mystery. Most disturbingly, he became a devout, born-again Christian. He was known for carrying a Bible and proselytizing to his co-workers with an almost manic intensity. He and Judith attended a strict, fundamentalist church. He would weep openly during services, seemingly overwhelmed by religious fervor. This religious fanaticism was not just a cover, it was an integral part of the twisted psychology that fueled his killings. In his mind, he was waging a holy war. He developed a deep-seated pathological hatred of prostitutes, whom he saw as the ultimate sinners, a source of temptation that he both craved and despised. This created an extreme cognitive dissonance. He would seek out these women to satisfy his desires, and then murder them as a form of perverse punishment, both for their sins and his own. In his confession, he would later describe his ritual. He would pick them up, often show them pictures of his family to gain their trust, read passages from the Bible to them, and then, in a sudden, violent turn, he would strangle them from behind. It was a level of compartmentalization. He inhabited two separate realities simultaneously, the pious family man and the merciless predator. For the victims' families, these quiet years were an agony of unanswered questions. Their daughters, sisters, and mothers were gone, their cases relegated to cold file cabinets. Dave Reichert, who eventually rose through the ranks to become the King County Sheriff, never let the case go. It was the defining mission of his life. He kept a small, dedicated team of detectives working on it, always hoping for a break, a new piece of evidence, a witness who would finally come forward. They knew the killer was likely still out there, living among them. They just needed a way to make him visible. As the 1990s wore on, that way began to emerge from the world of science. The field of genetics was undergoing a revolution. The ability to extract and analyze DNA from microscopic samples was changing the face of criminal investigation. It was a technology that could, with near-absolute certainty, link a suspect to a crime scene, even one that was decades old. It was a technology that could give a voice to the dead. In 1999, with Dave Reichert now leading the sheriff's office, the decision was made to commit new resources to the Green River case. The hope was that this new DNA technology, specifically a technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, could pull a name from the cold, silent evidence that had been sitting in storage for over 15 years. The task force's lead forensic scientist, Tom Lang, began the painstaking process of re-examining evidence from the earliest victims. He focused on samples collected back in 1982 and 1983, semen found on the body of Marcia Chapman and another victim, Carol Christensen. At the time of the murders, these samples could only tell investigators the killer's blood type, which was common. Now they held the potential to reveal his entire genetic code. The process was slow and methodical. The samples were old and degraded, but the PCR technique could amplify tiny amounts of DNA, creating enough material to generate a profile. A full, viable profile was successfully extracted. The Green River Killer now had a genetic fingerprint. The next step was to compare it against known samples. There was still no comprehensive national DNA database, so the investigators, led by Detective Tom Jensen, had to go back to their old files. They started pulling blood and saliva samples that had been collected from their top suspects back in the 1980s. It was a long shot. Among the evidence boxes was a small vial containing a dried saliva sample on a piece of gauze. It had been taken from a quiet truck painter back in 1987, 3 years after he had passed a polygraph, as part of a follow-up inquiry to get samples from all the primary original suspects. His name was Gary Ridgway. In September of 2001, in a state crime lab, the comparison was made. The DNA profile from the semen samples of Marcia Chapman and Carol Christensen, murdered in 1982, was put into the system. And then the profile from Gary Ridgway's 1987 saliva sample. The computer churned through the data. And then it stopped. A match. It was a 100% undeniable, scientifically certain match. After 19 years, the ghost had a face. The name that had been buried in the files, dismissed and forgotten, was now illuminated in the stark, certain light of science. Dave Reichert received the call he had waited nearly 2 decades to get. The name was Gary Ridgway, the quiet man, the churchgoer, the loyal employee, the husband, the killer. The discovery of the DNA match set in motion the final act. The task force moved with extreme caution. Ridgway had evaded them for 2 decades. They would not risk him slipping away. They placed him under 24-hour surveillance. For weeks, they watched him. They followed him to work. They followed him home. They watched him go grocery shopping. They saw a man living a life of utter banality. It was the perfect camouflage Bundy had described. And it was still working. He gave them no indication that he knew they were closing in. To strengthen their case, they needed a fresh DNA sample. An undercover officer bumped into him on the street, posing as a clumsy pedestrian, and quickly swabbed the handle of the lunchbox Ridgway was carrying. They also managed to get a saliva sample from him by having him chew on a piece of gauze as part of a fake workplace survey. Both samples confirmed the initial match. The case was now ironclad. On the morning of November 30, 2001, as Gary Ridgway left his shift at the Kenworth truck plant, the trap was sprung. A fleet of police cars surrounded his pickup truck. Dave Reichert, the detective who had begun the hunt 19 years earlier, walked up to the driver's side window. The man who had been the specter at the center of his professional life was now just feet away. Ridgway showed no surprise, no fear, no emotion at all. He was calm, almost placid, as the handcuffs were clicked onto his wrists. The longest manhunt in American history was over. The arrest of Gary Ridgway was a victory, but it was also the beginning of a new and profound dilemma for King County prosecutor Norm Milleng. The evidence linked Ridgway directly to 4 murders, but everyone knew he was responsible for dozens more. Milleng could take the DNA-proven cases to trial, almost certainly secure a conviction, and send Ridgway to death row. Washington had the death penalty, and if any case warranted it, this was it. The public and many of the victims' families were crying out for the ultimate punishment. But Milleng and the investigators faced a grim reality. A death penalty case would mean years of appeals, and it would only provide legal closure for the few victims linked by DNA. What about the others? What about the dozens of families whose daughters were still officially listed as missing, their cases unsolved, their bodies never found? A trial would be a legal battle over the crimes they could prove, not the full, horrifying scope of Ridgway's reign of terror. So, Milleng made one of the most controversial decisions in modern legal history. He offered Gary Ridgway a deal. He sent a team of prosecutors and detectives to meet with Ridgway in jail. They would take the death penalty off the table. In exchange, Ridgway had to confess to every single murder he had ever committed in King County. He had to plead guilty, and most importantly, he had to lead investigators to the remains of the victims he had hidden so well. It was a deal with the devil, a trade of ultimate retribution for ultimate truth. Ridgway, facing certain execution, accepted. In the months that followed, the full staggering scale of his monstrosity was revealed, not in a courtroom, but in a series of chilling, matter-of-fact debriefing sessions. For over 180 days, he sat with detectives and recounted a career of murder that defied belief. He spoke without remorse, without emotion, as if describing tasks on a checklist. He corrected investigators on details of murders they had wrong. He remembered the weather on the day of a killing 20 years prior, the clothes a victim was wearing, the exact words they exchanged. But he rarely remembered their names. They were not people to him. He referred to them as a girl, or that one. He confessed to killing so many women that he had lost count. He estimated the number was somewhere between 60 and 70. He described his methods in cold, mechanical detail. "I didn't hate them," he said of prostitutes. They were easy to pick up, and I got away with it." He admitted to the necrophilia that Bundy had suspected, explaining that he would often have sex with the bodies, sometimes multiple times over several days, before dumping. The most horrifying part of the agreement was yet to come. Ridgway began to lead the detectives on tours of his hidden graveyards. He took them to remote wooded areas, to steep ravines, to overlooked patches of land, and with a stunningly precise memory, he would walk to a spot, point to the ground and say, "She's here," and the investigators would dig, and they would find human bones. Skeletons that had lain undiscovered for almost 2 decades were finally brought into the light. For dozens of families, the phone calls they had dreaded for years finally came. Their daughters had been found. It was not the justice they had once hoped for, but it was a form of closure. It was an answer. It was a grave they could visit. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a King County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with the families of his victims. They stood, one by one, and unleashed 2 decades of pain and rage upon the small, graying man in the defendant's chair. He sat impassively, occasionally dabbing at his eyes with a tissue in a pathetic performance of remorse. He was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without parole, later increased to 49 when another victim was identified. In the end, we are left to dissect the anatomy of this case, to understand what made Gary Ridgway the most prolific serial killer in American history. The anatomy reveals a confluence of 3 critical factors. First was his choice of victim. He preyed upon the invisible, the marginalized, the women whose lives were so precarious that their absence barely registered. He exploited a tragic societal weakness, knowing that the disappearances of street-level sex workers and teenage runaways would not command the same attention as a missing suburban schoolgirl. His victim's vulnerability was his greatest asset. Second was his camouflage. His life was a masterpiece of deceptive normalcy. Bundy had theorized it, and Ridgway perfected it. The steady job, the multiple marriages, the overt religious piety, it was a shield of banality that deflected all suspicion. He understood that true evil doesn't always wear a dramatic costume. Sometimes it wears a work shirt, lives in a split-level home, and complains about the traffic. His evil was so deeply embedded in the mundane that it became functionally invisible. Third, and perhaps most crucial, was time and technology. He committed the bulk of his crimes in a predno world, an analog age when a killer could be swallowed by a sea of paper records, and a past polygraph was enough to erase suspicion. He was hunted by dedicated investigators, but they were hamstrung by the technology of their time. He was a ghost in the machine until a new machine was invented that could finally see him. The plea deal remains a subject of debate. Was it a betrayal of justice or its ultimate fulfillment? For some, sparing the life of a man who stole at least 49 lives is an unforgivable compromise. For others, the deal provided what no trial ever could: answers. It gave names to the nameless and graves to the lost. It forced an uncomfortable question upon the legal system. Is the purpose of justice to punish the guilty or to serve the living? In the case of the Green River Killer, King County chose the latter. Gary Ridgway succeeded for so long because he was a creature of the overlooked spaces. He hunted in the margins of society, and he lived in the margins of suspicion. He was a void, a human black hole whose unremarkable surface hid a gravitational pull of immense destructive power. His legacy is not just in the staggering number of his victims, but in the chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we fail to see at all. They are hidden not in the shadows, but in the bland, familiar light of everyday life. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.